And so I left off with the abortive civilizations. He mentions two of them. The first abortive civilization is the Western Christian version of the Celtic Christianity. That was cut short by the Viking invasions, which cut it off. And then the Vikings themselves were part of the abortive Scandinavian civilization, which he says was also cut short, drifted into isolation up in Iceland and Greenland, and became cut off from the main body of the world, of the Western world. And then he's got this idea that certain landscapes prove too troublesome for an effective response, and so you end up with arrested civilizations. And he lists the Polynesians, the Eskimos, the Spartans, and the Ottomans as examples of arrested civilizations. That is to say, they only get so far and then they stop developing. You know, obviously the Eskimos, frozen into this world of Arctic ice, can only develop so far. This is one of the questionable parts, I think, of Toynbee's thesis. It's also not very PC regarding, you know, you can sort of regard and dismiss indigenous peoples around the world as, you know, they're arrested societies that never made it up to the level of our, you know, our great and mighty Western society. So there's an aspect of Toynbee which can be thrown out, I think, but it's interesting to consider it nonetheless. So the Genesis phase, so we various stimuli bring civilizations into being. The stimulus of penalizations, when he talks about how you know, characters like Homer, who are blind, or Wieland the smith, who is lame, or Hephaestus the smith, who is lame, penalizations, physical penalizations of individuals can also produce greatness, basically. And so he looks at a number of these different stimuli, but the upshot of it is that a civilization has to be in a golden mean between it comes into being as the result of a response to challenges presented by a landscape that are neither too difficult, but they have to be difficult enough to produce this kind of greatness. And so that's the idea of genesis of civilizations. Now the next phase is growth. Civilization grow. They grow as the result of a creative minority who withdraw from the society, undergo an initiation, and return. Sound familiar? This, I think, is probably the likeliest source of inspiration for Joseph Campbell's idea of the hero's journey, the separation, initiation, and return. He did read Toynbee, refers to him in The Hero with 1,000 Faces, and I believe that he got that idea from Toynbee's model of withdrawal and return. The creative individual withdraws from a society, like Paul does when he goes out into the desert after he has his vision. He gets lost in the Arabian deserts for a few years and then comes back and articulates, you know, through writing these letters, these epistles, a whole new, you know, he articulates the basic ideas of Christianity, the theology of it. And then Christ himself going off into the desert for a few years and then coming back, Muhammad retreating into the cave, receiving the inspiration, and returning to create these civilizations. And so it's this constant creativity on the part of a creative minority that then inspires the uncreative majority of the society to imitate them. And it's the uncreative majority's consistent taking their lead from the charm and the spark of their creative minority that grows, that causes the civilization to grow and expand and unfold and come into being. So he's got a kind of great man theory of history, that the great man is absolutely essential and the creative elite are absolutely essential to keep a society growing. Then he goes into the third phase, which is breakdown. And what happens with breakdown, he also calls this the time of troubles, is that there is a breakdown into militarism, fratricidal civil wars. The time of troubles in the Hellenic society, for example, begins with the Peloponnesian Wars between Athens and Sparta, which are suicidal and lead gradually to the breakdown of the society. And in ancient Egypt, the time of troubles, as I've said, comes with the first interregnum, with the disintegration of the old kingdom and the first interregnum, and then the response coming out of that, the universal state of the Middle Kingdom, which was a kind of police state that held Egypt together by force. And he says what happens is that the society begins to lose faith in the leadership of its creative minority, and the creative minority turn into a dominant minority, and they try to rule by force. Instead of ruling by inspiration, they begin to rule by force because they're starting to lose inspiration. They're becoming conservative and protective of the original set of ideas, and they go to war, and you get civil wars, and eventually this will lead to the formation of a universal state. But we're not there yet. So you have this time of troubles, and you have certain philosophers that come into being during the time of troubles, like Confucius. In China, the time of troubles is even called that. It's the period of the contending states period that precedes the advent of the Qin Empire in 220 BC. The time of troubles there, the contending states, is from about 400 to 200 BC, roughly right in there, although that too is preceded by a time of troubles in the middle of the spring and autumn periods, about 600 BC, you start seeing lots of trouble going on in the Chinese civilization, and then you begin to get all these philosophers springing up. As Nietzsche says, the advent on the stage of the philosopher, a preponderance of mandarins, as he puts it, means that something has gone wrong in a society. It's not a sign of health. Just as when you get sick, the mind comes up and begins analyzing, and its analytical faculties start kicking in, and they want to know why you're sick. So you start getting all these philosophers, mandarins. In China, you get Confucius and Lao Tzu, and a lot of philosophers whose works have been lost from that period as the result of the burning of the books under Qin Shi Huangdi in about 200 or so BC. There's a lot of analysis, a lot of philosophers. We're obviously in that phase now. So that's the breakdown, the time of troubles. Then we have the disintegration phase. The disintegration phase can last for a long time, and in that we begin to see something happening in which the society in question breaks down into three fragments. You get three distinct fragments. You have the dominant minority is no longer creative now. It's a dominant minority, and it inspires an internal proletariat which secedes from that dominant minority, and an external proletariat. The simplest way to fill that in is to imagine the decline of Hellenic civilization during the period of the Roman civil wars, where you have its dominant minority, Caesar and Augustus, creating the universal state. The dominant minority creates the universal state, the internal proletariat creates a universal church, in this case Christianity, and the external proletariat create epic poetry. The barbarian war bands, during their period of what Toynbee calls a Volkerwanderung, creates an epos, an epic poetry. And the poems of Homer are part of that phase. In Hellenic civilization, that phase comes with all the Germanic and Celtic poetry, the Scandinavian epos and the Celtic poems, the Toyn, Beowulf, and the Scandinavian Eddas. Those all come out of the Germanic Volkerwanderung. So each one of these three groups creates its own institution, and what happens is that the internal proletariat secedes from the body social because it has lost faith in the creative minority's ability to lead. It's decayed into a dominant minority. It's now trying to command the society by force. And so this internal proletariat, and the internal proletariat is a very heterogeneous concept that Toynbee has. It covers a lot of things, but it basically has to do, he defines it with people who are, as saying, people who are in a society but no longer of it. For example, the Maccabean revolt is an example of this, of an internal proletariat that is encompassed by the Greek Seleucid, the Hellenic society, and they revolt against that and create, their own new state out of that. Or we get the revolt of Spartacus. The internal proletariat can include stateless exiles who are uprooted, disbanded, and they are absolutely upset with what is going on. And in the Hellenic world, a lot of these peoples were conscripted as mercenaries into the armies. A lot of them were homeless soldiers who had returned from wars to find their lands gone, bought up by senators, bought up by the rich, and they find themselves homeless. So they become this disaffected internal proletariat that is then taken up into the army, and all they can do is live as mercenaries, so they feed the war machine. There are other people who become slaves, and they're taken up into the great latifundia, these gigantic, colossal slave plantations, which correspond to today's corporations. They're massive, impersonal, and they're basically machines in places like Sicily and Spain and so forth. And so a number of things can happen, and these internal proletariats, very often, they become more and more discontented over time, and they revolt more and more against the dominant minority. And some of them are victims, but some of them are very, very aggressive, as the Maccabeans were, for example, or as the Spartacus slave revolt was. And what they end up doing is to create eventually a universal church, although, as in the case of Christianity, this took a very, very long time for the internal proletariat to cohere around that central body of ideas. And they dismantle the dominant minority, which in the meantime is busy in the process of creating a universal state, against the barbarian war bands who exist beyond the pale. They are the external proletariat because they're outside the society, which that means they're outside the limes. The Romans built walls along the Rhine and Danube frontier, in which the Germanic barbarian war bands were on the outside, and they were therefore external to the society. And so that external proletariat, Toynbee says, time is always on the side of the external proletariat. Sooner or later, they're going to come pouring across that frontier and wipe the civilization out of being. Now, this is an extremely interesting idea because I think it sheds a lot of light on what's going on in the world today. I think that Toynbee would think of the Islamists as an example of an external proletariat, because he does in one paragraph talk about how the Arabs who helped Lawrence during the World War I blow up the railroad tracks of the Ottoman Empire. He refers to those Arabs as a barbarian war band, as an external proletariat to our civilization. And I think he would think of the Islamists as external proletariat. The only problem is nowadays, though, this wall, this border dividing an interior of our civilization against an exterior no longer exists. That wall has now been displaced to outer space, to the thermosphere, which is composed of satellites orbiting around the planet. That's our modern limes. And so beyond that, there isn't anything. It's outer space. That's the new exterior of Western civilization, which has in the meanwhile gone ahead and assimilated all the other societies, so that there no longer is an exterior, and so there no longer really technically is an external proletariat. All disaffected peoples within this ecumeny are internal to this world sphere that we've erected. Now, societies can, once they create universal states, they can then proceed to assimilate and conquer other societies, the way the Ottoman Empire, when it was created as the universal state of what Toynbee calls the Iranic branch of Islam, created this universal state and used it to devour and assimilate the Byzantine Empire, simply assimilated it and provided Orthodox Christianity with its own universal state. So you can have two universal states, can be either indigenous to the society in question, as Rome's was, or they can be alien, as in the case of the Ottoman imposition on the Byzantines, or as in the case of the Mughals on India, or the British Raj on India. Those are examples of universal states that are imposed on their societies from alien sources. And Toynbee says then that when they do come of from alien sources, discontent grows more and more over time. So, for example, you get the Greek disaffection with their Ottoman rulers throughout the 19th century, and you get all these Greek civil wars, and eventually this goes all the way down to the karma of Bosnia and Yugoslavia in the 1990s. And then that leads us into the idea of the clash of civilizations, which is Huntington's idea. Huntington, obviously having read and digested Toynbee, comes up with this idea that now what we're looking at today is a clash of civilizations. What we had, Huntington says, during the Cold War was a bipolar world. Before that was the colonial world. The Cold War brought into being this bipolar world where you have a first world, you're either affiliated with capitalism or with communism, or if neither, you're in the third world. So it was a bipolar world. But nowadays, ever since the collapse of the Berlin Wall, Huntington says, the decisive factor for where an individual within a society will align himself is his affiliation and allegiance to that particular society, not to an ideology, but to that society. And he says, for example, that the Balkan crisis of Yugoslavia in the 1990s is actually the karma left over from the collision between three different civilizations. You know, you have the Bosnian Muslims there as karma left over from the breakup of the Ottoman Empire and the resentment against them on the Balkan Peninsula. You have the Serbs representing the Orthodox Christianity and the Croats representing Western Christendom. So you have a collision of three different civilizations into that one corner area. And so there is something to Huntington's idea of the clash of civilizations. I don't think we can just toss it out. Civilizations do encounter each other, they do collide, and as we've seen, one of those outcomes can be assimilation. The Hellenic civilization assimilated, for example, Egyptian civilization, devoured it, discarded it, dismantled it, and by the 5th century AD it was completely gone and assimilated into Christianity. There are other societies that attack and assimilate each other. But it is the case, I think, that Western civilization has assimilated all the other societies on the planet. If you look at the entry of the West, particularly in 1853 in Japan, the West enters in, demands trade, goes to war, a number of skirmishes with the Japanese, And then their response to that is the disintegration of the Tokugawa shogunate and the rise of the Meiji Restoration. And in Japan, that Meiji Restoration consists